Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast, your go-to hub to learn insights and the latest developments in the wild and wonderful world of Web3. I'm Alec Burns.
And I'm Jack Davis. Tune in each week as we navigate and explore the rapidly emerging landscape of the Web3 technologies, projects, and ideas that are shaping the future of the internet.
We'll be talking to the best and brightest in the industry to keep uncovering insights,
so that hopefully we can all learn together on our journey to untangle Web3. Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Hey Alec, how are you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm good. All the better for seeing your face and hearing your voice.
Yeah, this is fast becoming my favorite part of the week. So yeah, nice to be back for another one.
Yeah, no, it's exciting to talk about these things. And I think that the last episode was very interesting, talking about tokenization, NFTs. It's much more tangible than some maybe like the Web3 and blockchain. It's more practical, and I think it's more interesting to talk about with the use case. And I think the episodes we're going for now are probably going to reflect that too.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a nice way to start talking more about use cases instead of just the intangibles of Web3. But it's a big old topic, so I think we've only scratched the surface there, and we'll have to revisit tokens plenty of times in the future. So I guess, yeah, we've covered kind of some of the basics, the background on Web3, blockchain, and now tokens. And one of the things we haven't really touched on is kind of this idea of monetization. You hear lots of that in the token world as well, right? But we didn't really go too deep into the financial or monetary aspects last week.
Well, that was one of the things that I took from last week's episode is we could tokenize one of our podcast episodes, and potentially try to monetize it. And then when I kind of mentioned this to my mom, she was like, well, I wouldn't pay very much for it. And I was like, well, maybe there's a mechanism for that. Maybe we could use micropayments, which is the topic we're going to be talking about today, to actually facilitate the purchase of one of our episodes.
Very nice segue onto today's topic, Alec.
Supernatural and casual, I know.
So yeah, micropayments we're going to be talking about today and trying to discuss kind of what they are, because that's one of these core areas in Web3. It's something you'll hear a lot of people talking about. So, as ever, let's try and define this term first before we go any further. So what does micropayments mean to you, Alec?
So micropayments to me is being the ability to send a very small amount, like, less than 10p or less than a penny to someone for a very cheap fee, basically for a very cheap transaction fee.
Yeah, exactly. I think, it's something we encounter a little bit in real life, but I wouldn't call them micropayments necessarily. Like, I think one of the things, what's the smallest thing you've ever paid for? I think I mentioned penny sweets in the first episode on Web3, which was a little bit of an outdated reference, but you're not used to going into a store and spending less than a few pounds, right? Because normally they won't take a card payment for that. So micropayments is really, it includes those things that you can't, those values that are so small that you can't pay for them in brick and mortar shops, but then it also will encompass a huge range of even smaller payments that are, maybe sub penny or sub cent, maybe 10th or 100th of a cent per transaction. And we're going to kind of explore today what might you be wanting to pay for of that in that amount.
No, exactly. I think that we talk about small payments, like being able to send a penny, 5p. What was it? Freddos used to cost 5p back in the day. Now they're up to a pound or something crazy like this. But you can't imagine why you'd want to pay for very small goods with with change or cash typically. And I could say transfer really 2 or 3p to you on your Monzo or your bank account. but I couldn't do that with a card. Like, what can you actually pay for? What's the minimum amount on a card? I think that's the difference between, say, a microtransaction, like you were saying before, which is sometimes less than a penny, and a small transaction, which is probably like 5 pennies to a pound potentially. And I think, yeah, one of the most interesting things that we're going to touch on today is, what would you want to pay for that costs less than a penny? Like, when I first kind of came across this topic, I didn't understand why you would ever want to send, fractions of pennies to people. But yeah, I think the idea of micropayments is actually quite revolutionary, and it's going to be a whole paradigm shift. And there's going to be whole business models that are derived specifically from that concept, which we couldn't even imagine, 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's worth, maybe if we just quickly go back into the history of payments on the internet, to kind of see how we've arrived at the current state and why this micropayment paradigm is a new thing. So one of the kind of references I really like is in the early development of Web 1, so the earliest stage of the internet, where it was just kind of this idea of sharing data and information widely with anyone. When they were building the kind of core protocols for doing this information sharing, we're aware of this thing called the hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP. You might see it when you type in an address in your search bar or on Google. And one of the things that protocol includes is these things called status codes. So if you've been to a website and there's not something there, you might get a 500 for a server error or something on the web page. And one of the status codes was actually, I think it's 402, and the message was called payment required. And this was kind of put there in the early days of Web 1, right? Because they were envisaging that you might visit a website and have to pay a small amount of money, say 10 cents or some other small micropayment to access the data, instead of how we typically now have it. Everything's free, always behind some kind of bigger paywall that requires your credit card.
Yeah. And I think so, yeah, just when Jack talks about HTTP, I mean, that's effectively the kind of the rules of what's the protocol for transferring and interacting with, sending data across the web. Basically, it's what enables interoperability across the web. So when he says that there was this 402 kind of code or protocol in that, it means that they had this in mind. They thought this was going to be a mechanism that people would want to embed payments, small payments for data exchange. But I would ask, why didn't that happen? Like, it seems like, it's something we're talking about right now. They obviously thought about it when they were developing the web. Why didn't it happen?
Exactly, that's the big question, right? What if the early developers were thinking about it? Well, why didn't we, start paying for websites like that in a small kind of granular way? So I think the main answer is that there wasn't a payment system that could do that could facilitate small transactions. So the developers of the internet thought, I'm sure we'll get a payment system that can do this, and never really materialized. So then, that leads us to the question, why didn't one of these payment systems materialize? And I think that's all down to the costs of the incumbent payment systems and the cost of running a payment system in general. So, when you go and make a debit card payment in a store, for example, there are a number of different fees associated with that transaction. Now, as the consumer, you won't necessarily see those fees. You just get the price on the terminal, you tap your card and off you go. But the merchant actually has to deal with a lot of these. And I think there's typically 3 fees involved. So there's a fee involved with the bank that issues the debit card you're using. There's a fee involved with the terminal that the merchant's using, the point of sale terminal that you tap your card at. There's a fee for using one of those, which are actually very high. And then there's also a payment processing fee that you get that goes to a Visa or a MasterCard for settling that payment, essentially making sure that it goes through and that there's this communication between the two banks. And all the parties involved there are taking, they have to be paid for doing that service. So they're taking costs away at 3 different points, and those costs stack up basically, so that below a certain point it wouldn't be there would be no revenue in it for them to offer payments below. Yeah. I mean, I think the limit is pretty low right now. I think you can't do anything below 50p or something would be completely infeasible.
Yeah, so like you said, there's a lot of intermediaries that are involved in, just me submitting a transaction or trying to purchase something with a card in quite what I see is quite a simple payment. But there's a lot of intermediaries involved in actually getting that payment to the merchant's bank account effectively. So we have this like flat fee plus a percentage, which doesn't scale. So when, if you say I'm buying something for 50p, then with all the fees that are included, if they did support this, the actual purchase might cost 80p. And, that just doesn't make sense. If I know an item's worth 50p and I'm being charged 80p, or the merchants, someone's being charged 80p, that markup doesn't make sense. And I think to make this tangible, this is the reason that a lot of places, don't accept Amex, for example, because the fees on Amex are so high that it actually puts a lot of pressure on the merchant to sell, at a higher price. Basically, it's why small businesses don't typically support people like or institutions like Amex, and it stops the sales of small products.
Yeah, and if you ever walked into a shop that has this minimum card spend, that's the same effect. And it's important to know that it's not just digital payments. Like when you're using your bank money, that's kind of a form of digital money, but it's not free to handle cash either. When you make a cash payment, there are also costs on the merchant for handling your cash and processing it that again you don't see as the customer, but the merchant incurs, which would if we wanted to pay a penny for something in a shop, that would also make that more difficult. And then when you look at the internet, right?
Exactly. No one's buying your penny sweets.
There's probably more than one reason why we don't buy penny sweets anymore. But yeah, so how does that then map to the internet, right? Because we're talking about web payments. So how do we get from the world of the cost of brick and mortar payments to the web?
Well, I think one other point that kind of relates to the question there, which I think was another inhibitor, it wasn't in my mind, it wasn't just about the fact that institutions made it prohibitively expensive to do micropayments because of the unnecessary intermediaries. I think there was also like a mental aspect to the consumers and the users. If I offer two solutions, one where you pay for exchange on the internet using micropayments, and another that's free, and you have some ad-based internet, which I think is what you were just alluding to, Jack. If to me, like the initial upfront cost of potentially having to pay for all engagements seems like the worst option of the two. And I think that was maybe short-sightedness, because they didn't see that advertising would become such a big part of the social media. Facebook classically didn't have advertisements at first. It got the user engagement, and you see, okay, I'm getting a free service, an incredible free service. I get involved, it gets very sticky, and then all of a sudden the advertising comes in. And I think that's the mechanism you're thinking about, because we don't have this kind of inbuilt micropayments for data exchange in the internet because of the reasons we just stated. Internet bases or internet companies had to move towards a more ad-based internet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe just to disentangle a couple of concepts here. So I think you're kind of touching on the larger point that we can kind of delve into now, but it's also worth remembering, like, what payment systems have existed for the internet itself. I think one of the earliest dominating ones would be something like PayPal, right? So some of the earliest transactions I ever did on the internet were with PayPal. You basically had companies like PayPal. We also have Stripe now, but making it easier for people to accept payments on the internet, and they have a very similar business model, if not even more expensive, with even higher fees. So the same problem that exists in the real world became a problem of the internet, and that combines with exactly what you were saying there, right? It combines with what was the actual business model on the internet, which is this advertising-based, subscription-based, monetizing your clicks. Essentially, you're monetizing your attention model that came about on the internet. So, you have these two things. You have the fact that there's no real payment system that is low fee, and then two, the internet decided, well, we don't really care about that anyway. We're gonna make our money using something a very different model, which is what we're all kind of accustomed to now in Web 2.
Yeah, definitely. So without the ability to charge users seamlessly in small increments, I guess like the big media players, they needed scale, where you either had an audience or a user base that was loyal enough to subscribe and pay regularly, or more and more the user base was big enough for advertisers to care and them to make money from the actual advertising that was on there. And to relate this back to your point, now I've learned what clickbait is. I imagine this is one of the reasons that clickbait is so prolific, is because it's all about traffic and not substance. And this is like one of the things I think people, we talk about social media a lot, but I think this is one of the things that people are starting to wake up to. That the classic line that we keep repeating, I think everyone repeats, is if you're not paying for something, you're the product. People are starting to wake up to the fact that, they are paying with their time, with the content that they're looking into, with clickbait, all these kind of things. And maybe there are alternatives that are coming out, social media alternatives, where I do pay a little bit, but I get a better service because of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think if we want to ever monetize this podcast, we would end up feeling the same forces of the internet business model. We would have to be competing with or using the algorithm, right, that everyone is subject to. So I always find it funny when you see a lot of people talking about being a digital nomad and working for themselves, not working for a boss. So they start an online media company. They're producing content on TikTok or YouTube or something. But for me, they've in a lot of cases they actually replace a 9-to-5 boss with the big opaque algorithmic boss in the sky. And if they don't do what makes the algorithm happy, then they really struggle. So it's kind of a scary situation to be in. I think that so much of monetizing things online is now based on these big players and their algorithms that we don't necessarily know how they work either.
Yeah, well, you can't see this, but Jack is head to toe in branding. But little did the branders know that it's actually not. There's no audio. That's no visuals that are being released right now. But yeah, you are right. And content creators who build followers, and they actually do add value. They're completely reliant on social media for outreach, and because of like these lack of financial tools for consumers to directly incentivize the content creators, they have to rely on either revenue sharing with the platform itself, with Facebook, or they have to rely on advertising or brand merchandising in the content they create. So yeah, I think the idea of direct payments in this nature, which we're going to talk about a bit later, is going to create it's going to definitely affect influencers and content creators.
Exactly. So I think maybe just to summarize that thought on what's the state of play in Web 2, we kind of have an internet now where we never saw a micropayment system evolve, and in its place we have kind of two dominant modes of monetizing things. One is things that are free at the point of use or that look free, but you're actually paying with your attention, your time, through advertising and things. And then the second business model is this subscription based one where you might get some things for free. They might sometimes call it a freemium model. You might get some content for free or some service for free, and then the platforms have to monetize by making you subscribe to something. Like we've talked about online newspapers, which do that. They might give you 3 free articles, but then you have to enter a £10 a month subscription or something. So that's kind of the state of play of Web 2. So where does Web 3 come in then? What's the relationship of micropayments in Web 3? How are we looking to solve these problems?
So I think so. Okay, if we're saying that Web 3 is based on the principles of Bitcoin, blockchain, in a model in which interaction is more peer-to-peer, and we don't need these unnecessary intermediaries, we can have these cheap micropayments or these cheap transactions, which allows us to, for example, directly monetize data ownership. If I own my data and someone wants to access it, I can monetize their access to my data, for example. I think we're going to assign value to data exchange, and there's going to be a lot more transparency in the operations of value exchange. Whereas right now, I don't know how people use my data. For example, I don't know how Facebook's using my data, the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all this kind of stuff. I think in the Web3 model, in which social media platforms based in it actually monetize through direct engagement, you see where that monetization comes from. There's going to be a lot more transparency, a lot more trust in the process, but also a lot better distribution of the value to the end consumers as well. And I think there's all the stuff around improved kind of solutions. I think we're going to go into a bit later about bots and spam and how we can kind of make these issues redundant in a Web3 model, where we're kind of associating value to actual data exchange as well. But yeah, that's my high level kind of understanding of how Web3 is going to affect micropayments or vice versa.
Yeah, I think I completely fully agree with that. I would say Bitcoin is essentially what presented the first practical way to do micropayments by incentivizing a competitive network to process payments instead of it being like a large gatekeeping network that's more rent seeking, let's say. So, Web3 being partially, if not, almost entirely based on the industry that started with Bitcoin, taking that micropayments idea into the mainstream is a huge part of that. I like what you're talking about there with monetizing data, because that's kind of wrapping up some of the other problems we've been talking about into this, right? It's not just there's one problem that we can't do micropayments to pay for, looking at a website. That's one issue that we might want to solve on the web on the internet. But since those early days when they had the status code, they also didn't envisage that we'd be essentially giving up our data for free to use the internet. And we also want to monetize that. And that's where they kind of go hand in hand. Micropayments are small in nature, micro, and so is data. So are these incremental pieces of data that you're giving. Every time you take an action, you click something, you watch a video or something. These are all small kind of granular actions. And how do you value them? Well, you need a payment system that can do to make small enough valuations, right? It needs to be able to. Micropayments are the only thing that can apply financial value to an item of data, essentially, an action or a recording of something, recording an action you've done. So for me, it's kind of funny that we've come full circle in that micropayments that were envisaged right at the beginning are now being reintroduced to solve some of the downstream problems that Web 2 brought along with it.
Yeah, and I wonder if one of the limiters on this is that, a lot of people say, well, it's actually not that cheap to transact on, Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these things, and there's congestion and the lack of scaling issues that we've seen. The fact that there's more transactions per limited space means that the transactions fee are actually getting higher, and these blockchains that are underneath supporting these models, they need scaling to kind of facilitate this as the adoption and the user base increases.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of there's some level of hypocrisy, right, in the claim of Web3 to do micropayments, but in practice, many blockchains are that expensive that they've become what they seek to disrupt, in that the cost of using them is so high in many cases. But I think when we talk about micropayments in Web3, we're talking about this model that in some cases is being proven, and so long as you can scale a blockchain, then all these use cases and possibilities are possible, and that's kind of why we want to focus on those.
They become what they seek to disrupt. Was that like a direct reference to Star Wars? I like that.
Now I'm thinking is it Batman? You live long enough to see yourself become the enemy, or something like that. There is a quote.
I thought it was Obi-Wan when it says you became the very thing that you sought to destroy, the Sith. Anyway, I think we're going to tangent a little bit, so maybe that's a good point to call a break.
Okay, so we've had a stab at talking about micropayments in general and what we think they are and how they relate to the different phases of growth of the internet. So I think at this point we normally turn to I won't call it our friend this week because Alec thinks that's weird, but we'll turn to ChatGPT to compare our definition and see if it can tease out any other things we missed.
I think ChatGPT is your friend and my tool, maybe. But yeah, so ChatGPT describes micropayments as small financial transactions, typically online, that usually involve amounts less than $1. These types of transactions are common in various internet services. Okay, nice. I think we define that pretty well. I think we actually define them as much less than $1. But yeah, I wouldn't know if I'd define 50p as a microtransaction, maybe, but this has been pedantic. The second part of the definition is micropayments provide a way for digital service providers to earn money without having to charge a large amount all at once. It's like going to a store and buying one apple instead of a whole bag. I like that. That's quite an easy to understand example, and I think it's going to become much more tangible for people once we start to go into some of the use cases of micropayments.
Yeah, definitely. I think I really like that as well. That second part, because it's hinting at this idea of efficiency or economic efficiency that it's something I have a big problem with personally with the subscription model, is that you end up paying a big chunk of money every month for something that you may or may not be using. I've had subscriptions where I've not turned on the service at all, but I've still paid £10, and that's, for me, that's an inefficiency in my money. But we all have these kind of subscriptions. It's great for the platform sometimes, but
I bet you tell your girlfriend that you're just paying for the subscriptions, you're not actually using them.
No, not like that. But
I'm just messing with you. Yeah, so why don't we go into some of these actual models that we keep hinting at? Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think so I think there are two kind of key areas of opportunity we have with micropayments that are slightly different applications of them. So one of them is on micro incentives, and the other is then, I think, payment streaming. So I'm just going to focus on micro incentives first, and another term you may have heard for this is gamification, and I think lots of us are becoming quite familiar with the idea of gamification through things like education and health. So I know things like Duolingo, for example, are a really good example of how you gamify learning a language. So you have small tasks to complete. You get small rewards when you do some vocab testing or something to learn a language. And then in health, you also have I know Vitality has quite a well-known health program where you're doing some small activities, filling in a health report, doing 10,000 steps a day. You get a small reward for that can build up over time to get a free coffee or something. So gamification is a really interesting thing, and there's a lot of research showing that it's effective at incentivizing behavior. So I think taking that to the next level is basically what micropayments can do. Is instead of, in those examples, Duolingo, there's no real financial incentive. It's just it's a psychology thing. And in the Vitality example, you might be earning a coffee at the end of a week or a month, but you're not getting these small incremental payments. You kind of have to redeem it all in one go. So micropayments essentially let you be directly incentivized for everything you do, and this is good for the user because obviously they can get paid for something to do something, but it's also good for companies if they want to incentivize their customers to do something, to provide a little piece of data, to fill in a survey. How many times have you had a survey, someone asked you to fill in a survey and you've kind of gone, I can't be bothered with that. If you're going to get paid 5p to do it, I think you would, right? So that's kind of an exciting one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Emma asked if I knew what the term gamification was. And I do. I am a gamer, so I understand it. I've been very hooked on certain games. I mean, it was when they threshold, they're like, earn 2 more points and you get this milestone. And I've been playing the game for like 10 hours and I can't really see straight anymore. But I still push for those two extra points just to level up. Like, you completely get this. Like, the gaming industry is so into this. And I think other industries are now catching up and being like, how can we apply the kind of the tools and the mechanisms of the gaming industry to real world life? Because I mean, in a way, they've kind of proven that it's quite addictive and it's very sticky, and people love this kind of stuff, don't they?
Exactly. And I think that to give a kind of concrete example of how powerful this is in something like recycling. And I know this is actually happening in other countries already. There are places that are much further ahead of the UK than this, but there is I may have mentioned this already in a previous episode, but there's a plastic bottle return scheme that's being implemented in Scotland, if it hasn't already started. And I think the idea is that as a consumer, plastic bottles that you get in a shop for your Coca-Cola or your kind of your Fanta bottle or whatever it is, you can get 20p back off the cost price of that item when you take it to a recycling center, which is a very clear incentive for someone to recycle, and it's a positive action that can help towards the kind of net zero goals of the UK. I think Emma said in the chat, Malta is a good example of this, where they've been ahead of the curve on that. And it's a nice example. I use the Scotland one because it's 20p, so it falls in this micropayment range that we're talking about, and it just shows there's so many places that you could apply that logic. And I particularly like it for this kind of B2C angle, business to customer, where you could have a big company that wants to engage its customers better, instead of just sending out these impersonal emails that are just informative. Maybe a company is trying to educate its customers on environmental issues. Instead of just sending out an email that gives them information, maybe I incentivize them to perform a little test or take a quiz to prove that I have actually educated them, instead of it just being informative. I'm actually proving the impact that we've got. So I don't know if there's any other examples of that kind of incentive scheme that interest you, Alec, but that's one that I find particularly interesting.
Yeah, I really like the recycling one that you spoke about. You can imagine, like, not just the governments incentivizing that scheme, but also, if I can scan a QR code of a Coca-Cola bottle or something like that, then it's Coca-Cola itself that gives me the money for that, because they can prove, they can offset their carbon footprint, prove that they're more ethical. And, what we say was micro incentives of 20p in this country. I mean, that's not necessarily micro for someone in, I don't know, sub-Saharan Africa. So like this is scalable to other countries as well. I know there's in certain countries where there are lots of plastic bottles. These are actual kind of like full-time jobs for people. So there's like real money to be had from these schemes. It's not just like a little side hustle, which we'd probably see in the UK. Like real kind of economies can grow from this. In terms of like other angles that I think we can look at, I am a big time reviewer. Like I love reviewing services, like on Google, absolutely everything. I just love going to a restaurant.
I knew there were people out there that do this. I'm glad we found one.
I am the person, like people appreciate it. So that I because I'm so into it, I don't even know like how much people appreciate it. It's like so 70% of consumers prefer user reviews or consumer reviews to marketing and advertising. People love that kind of stuff, and people need at least 4 reviews before they trust in the product of a company. And my point is, like, how do you know when reviews are authentic? How do you know when reviews are authentic? Like, it's a big question. Like, you see so many kind of spams online, especially on Amazon and things like that. And I think related to the last episode, imagine being able to tokenize a purchase to prove that, you paid for that cola bottle. You actually, do own that cola bottle tangibly. And then you can link the ability to review that cola bottle because of your purchase. So that's the one element. But to relate to gamification, how do you incentivize honest consumers to review? One way would be micro incentive. You don't want to like have to give over £5 out for a review, but 5 or 10p just to leave a quick review. Like I think a lot of people would be inclined to do that. And it's the same with like loyalty programs. You can link this to loyalty, whereas say in coffee shops, it's more economical for them to offer a free coffee on the 8th coffee that you purchase. You could incentivize people directly by giving small amounts, like give them 5, 10p per purchase back, and they can reuse that in store potentially.
Yeah, 100%. I think, the applications for this are kind of endless, and there are so many ways that micropayments can be integrated to kind of what you're talking about in reviews. Like I think of something like Q&A services like Quora online. There's a model there to be had where you can have micropayments just for answering, but then you have subsequent micropayments reflect the quality of your answer. So normally you have like 10 answers given to a particular question, and then people come in and up or down vote them. They'll rank them, and if you have a micropayment, I know, but not everyone necessarily spends all their time Googling the answers to their problems like you, Alec. Some people, might not rely on the internet. So
I'm just there upvoting your answers every time.
Yeah, and again, that's incentivizing the right kind of behavior. I think is crucial. That's why I kind of say micropayments for micro incentives. You're trying to change or incentivize a type of behavior, like recycling is one example, and then quality of information is the other we're talking about here. So yeah, I think reviews, surveys, online questionnaire kind of things is a really good example.
Even
I just realized
Oh, I was going to say, even to link it back to the social media that we were talking about earlier, like there's such a problem with bots on Twitter and fake accounts and spam accounts and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we also talked about the fact that it's really difficult for influencers to be directly incentivized. They have to add brands and advertisers and all this kind of stuff. Like imagine if you could, directly, I think we used this in a previous example, directly engaging and directly sending micropayments to people. That would also kill off the entire kind of botscape that exists on Twitter. If they can, bots are really easy to spin up and make a quick bot account that then spams people and is quite aggressive and, is to the detriment of the platform. But if we start charging micro payments per engagement online, you get rid of all these bots, don't you? Like they no longer become economical. And you could apply this to emails as well. Like, how many spam emails do you get? Imagine if it costs like a small micro payment to send an email. It would just remove the ability for spam accounts to just send out millions of emails to accounts they've never even recognized or never even heard of.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a super interesting point, right? You touched on. I just want to mention before I kind of talk about email, the social media one is really powerful, and it comes from, I think, an asymmetry of cost that you have. So just by going from a free to a it costs something model completely changes. It introduces a huge asymmetry to be a bad actor. So even if the cost, it's non-zero, but it doesn't have to be high. It could be tiny. It could be a tenth of a p to post, but it then becomes so expensive to subvert, to spin up a million accounts. And it's the asymmetry between behaving in a socially good way, let's say, and then behaving as a bad actor trying to subvert. So I think it's kind of this whole new paradigm. And the email example I love, and I'm so glad you mentioned it because I completely forgot about this. But are you aware of the proof of work aspect of email, Alec? Is that something you come across?
No, I'm not. But I'm sure you're about to enlighten me.
Cool. So this is such a nice link to Web3, I think, actually. So proof of work, before I carry on, is we may have touched on it, I'm sure, in previous episodes, but it's this idea that you need to expend energy to do some work to prove that you've kind of made you've sunk some cost into something, right? And it's the kind of the bedrock of how Bitcoin works and how many other blockchains work. So proof of work is this thing that essentially commits you to a cost to do something. Now, proof of work has been massively popularized by Bitcoin, but it was actually used earlier than that for email. So emails, and they might even still do it. I'm not entirely sure, but at some point, at least in the past. So every email you would send would have this small proof of work attached to stop spamming. And it's the same idea of asymmetric cost. It will be very expensive to do this proof of work for millions of emails to spam a lot of people, but for the average email, it doesn't cost much. So
is that happening now? I don't understand. How has this not been implemented? I get spam all the time. It's so tiresome.
Yeah, I think it was definitely implemented in some places. I don't think it's used widely, and it never really caught on because it wasn't trying to be too prohibitive. I think email, when it came about, the idea was making it as open as possible. But it's just interesting that the idea has existed of trying to stop spam by adding a cost, right? That's the key idea. And now micropayments people are looking at social media as a way of doing this. And, as a concrete example, we've seen, I think in the last few weeks, Elon Musk. So Elon Musk has also gone full circle, right? From founding PayPal as one of these first payment systems and the internet that stopped micropayments. He is now proposing that they allow that for news publishers on Twitter. So you can pay a small amount to read an article on Twitter, which is kind of really fascinating to me.
Yeah, we tried to get him on as a guest today, but I think he's a bit busy, and annoyingly. Maybe next episode we'll get him on.
Yeah, hopefully.
But the other aspect, we've talked about micro incentives, gamification. So the other one that I want to speak about, I think you touched on it a bit earlier, Jack, is payment streaming, which I find very exciting. This is where I really see a business model kind of flipping, and much more kind of, it's really focused on the consumer and benefits to the consumer. So really quickly, we're very used to the concept of paying subscriptions, paying on a yearly basis for, you know, your Spotify, your Netflix, Amazon Prime, whatever it is. But most people, even though they have the option to pay yearly, they tend to pay monthly, even if over the course of that year that costs a bit more. And you know, the reason for this is it's better consumer cash flow. No one really wants to pay £100 upfront for the year when they can pay, you know, £10 every month because of cash flow. So it means I have more money per month and I can better manage my money. But also, like you said earlier, I think you guarantee that you pay for what you use. If I pay for a year upfront and I don't like the service, after 2 months, then I can just stop. I still have to pay for the remaining 10 months. But if I pay on a monthly basis, the most I'll ever lose is a month worth of payment if I decide to stop using it. So that's the second benefit. But the final benefit of breaking, you know, large subscription payments down to smaller payments is you guarantee that there's consistent content quality. If all of a sudden the streaming service becomes poor, again, I'm going to cancel my subscription. So there's potentially more pressure on them to keep outputting good quality content. And this is like a really common concept. Everyone understands it. People tend to want to pay monthly over yearly. I think it's like 70%. Well, I know 70% of consumers prefer to pay monthly over annual subscriptions, and 90% of consumers around the world have at least one rolling subscription service. So this is like very common concept. But why do we limit it to monthly would be my question. Wouldn't you prefer to pay for a service, you know, on a daily basis or an hourly basis or even like a by-second basis, Jack?
Well, and this is, to be honest, I mean, I'm going to call this an open question, right? So one of the things I know there's this research out there that talks about like what's the maximum number of subscriptions a US household is willing to have, and it's quite low. It's something like 4 or 5. And part of that is obviously to do with the cost of having many subscriptions. Part of it might also be due to the mental energy of managing the subscriptions. And I'm kind of holding out judgment on whether people will, for all applications, if people will prefer the idea of paying monthly because it's kind of a way of bundling up lots of small interactions into an easy to manage cost that takes less mental energy. Will people be able to get around the hurdle of saying, no, I'm going to pay for exactly what I use, but it means I can see payments going out all the time? And I don't know actually if that will be something that people latch onto, or maybe people will prefer the subscription model for that reason. But I guess that's a problem of user experience, right? And how you design the solutions.
Yeah, I think for me, so that the concept of this is, like I said, breaking rather than, you know, paying on a yearly basis or a monthly basis, breaking it even smaller increments that are paid more regularly. So like, you know, rather than paying monthly for your entire Netflix subscription, you pay per episode that you watch. Or rather than paying, the example you gave, I think in one of the first episodes, was rather than paying for a newspaper up front, you pay this £10 for the whole newspaper, not knowing how good the newspaper is going to be. You pay per page that you read. You pay like 10p per page that you read. But you can even apply this to gyms, swimming pools, all these kind of things, pay per second that you're actually there. And I think, I don't think that this model is going to necessarily replace like existing subscription models. And because, like, for the reasons you mentioned, some people prefer convenience, even if it means they might potentially lose out on quality or have like worse cash flow management purely because of the convenience. But I think there will be an alternative, especially for people that, you know, are kind of more economically strapped. Like, you want to break these payments down into smaller models. Like if someone said to me, okay, I'll offer a Netflix equivalent where you pay daily and I'm tight that month, yeah, why wouldn't I opt for that kind of solution? I only use Netflix, you know, well, I actually use Netflix a lot of the time. But if I only use Netflix on weekends, maybe I only want to start my subscription on a Friday night and finish it on a Sunday morning and just binge an entire series for the weekend and then stop my subscription again.
Yeah, I'd say Netflix is probably the one subscription where I do get my money's worth, and probably more. But I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, because it's not, again, and a lot of people will throw the baby out with the bathwater with Web3 and go, we're going to replace everything. But no, it's about, I think micropayments are essentially just a credible alternative to the subscription-based model. And people will love the payment streaming flavor of micropayments. Probably if the cost is important enough to them, people who want the convenience will probably opt for the subscription model and carry on. But, you know, you only have to think of something like energy payments. I think that is exactly the kind of thing where, you know, we have a pseudo micropayment model with these smart meters where you can track how much you're using. You kind of you have a micro monitoring system, but you're not actually paying in increments. You're still just paying at the end of a month. But I think energy is a good example of where you really do want to pay for only what you use, and you don't want to pay for anything more or less. So that maps to micropayments and payment streaming perfectly, I think.
I think a good example that I've experienced in my past is like paying for tutors or paying for therapists, like physical therapists, like all this kind of stuff. They have really high expenses. It's like it's £80 per hour, £100 per hour. You pay up front. There's no like guarantee of quality. Like imagine, I would be so much less risk involved if I was to pay per minute. If I was to say, okay, I pay £1 per minute that I'm actually in there, like I guarantee straight away that there's lower risk because they're going to be assured quality from their side. And I'd be so much more willing to opt into services like that if they existed.
Yeah. And it just kind of lowers the barrier to entry to accessing services, right? I think that's kind of the crux of what you're saying is I don't need to pay a 50, 60, 70 pound upfront fee to do something. I can just pick up the phone because this you could conceive of I've seen Web3 applications where you can pay per second of someone's time, and people can list their rates. Maybe they're 10p a second, maybe they're £5 a second if they're an Elon Musk, maybe even more. But at least it gives you a way of having some kind of level of access to work out what you need. And there are so many. You might have a conversation where your problem gets resolved instantly, and you don't want to have to pay this big chunk of cost for something, and then you might have other examples where you do need to pay longer. So it's again just a more efficient way of allocating resources, but it also lowers the bar to people accessing the resources in the first place, I think, which is really useful.
Yeah, and like it might not be suitable for everyone. Like you said before, that some people will opt for convenience, paying monthly. But some people might, use more than the mean. They might be the kind of the top 1% of Netflix users like you. So maybe a pay per episode subscription wouldn't work because you'd be, watching it 18 hours a day every day. And you probably price yourself out. So it's not for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are plenty of caveats as with everything. But I think broadly, we're quite optimistic about both these propositions of micropayments.
I'm so excited, especially for content like media, even like access to facilities. I find this like to be such an exciting kind of prospect. I'm really looking forward to seeing what businesses will start to deploy it.
Yeah, for sure. It's very much the space of possibilities opening up. We don't know what you can do with this, right? We're just listing things that we think we're actually listing a lot of existing businesses and business models that could be altered using micropayments, but we kind of are ignoring all the possible new business models that we don't even know of, and the new companies and use cases that we can't even conceive of right now that will be made possible by micropayments. So I think that's also what excites me, is the unknown here. Maybe to finish today, I think another hot topic, right, is AI, artificial intelligence, in the news with things like ChatGPT.
You don't say.
Yeah, I mean we've been for a number of episodes talking to our friend ChatGPT, but we haven't talked about the significance necessarily. And I think everyone's talking about these large language models and chatbots and things, but I think it's worth us considering how micropayments could impact them and how they might be related. Because I personally think it's a huge potential marriage of the two things. But I wanted to know, do you have any opinions on that yourself?
Are you talking about like what the economic usage? So right now is like, are you talking about how I pay per usage of ChatGPT? Are you talking about how the data is actually exchanged in the back end?
Well, I think both, right? I think Web3 and AI have lots of different overlap. Like I think, the most obvious use case is just micropayments for usage of them, because I don't know if you've seen a few weeks ago the Mid-Journey service, so the one that generates these photorealistic images based on text prompts. You can describe what you want and it'll spit out an amazing image, which is again really scary. But they had a free trial and it was so inundated with use that they had to stop the free trial, and you have to go straight to subscription now. And it got me thinking, wow, if you just had micropayments available to you pay 10p, 50p. I mean, people will pay a lot of money for these pictures, before Midjourney, you probably pay hundreds of pounds to an agency to do these things for you. So you could be charging 50p a pound for every use of the Midjourney service instead of forcing people to jump straight into an expensive subscription. So I think, just funding the AI models themselves is a great use case for micropayments.
Yeah, well, you tell me now. I mean, I'm one of those suckers that signed up to the ChatGPT subscription, but even then, they give you like a number of uses. So it's like so obvious. Like you get 25 uses a day or something like that for ChatGPT 4. So it directly aligns with the amount that I'm paying. Like I suppose the problem is that over the month that I pay for 25 uses a day, like it does break down effectively to fractions of a penny per usage, and there's not the economic models to support it right now. Well, they don't think there is anyway, but we kind of uncovered this episode that there are the economic models to support it. So that effectively wraps up the episode. We've talked about micropayments, what we think they are, how we've kind of come full circle from the early inception of micropayments and are now actually getting to a state where we can start to deploy them and use them in real businesses. We've gone through two main kind of applications, micro incentives and payment streaming, and we went through a lot of applications and use cases where these can be applied. So yeah, I think micropayments is an extremely, extremely exciting topic, and the kind of the use cases and possibilities are endless. So yeah, thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.